June 4, 1942, Midway Atoll. The Pacific dawn broke in silence. A thin line of gold spread across a gray horizon where ocean met sky, endless, indifferent. The wind was still cool, carrying the faint smell of salt and aviation fuel. Seagulls circled above the tiny coral island. A speck of sand, a few airstrips, and scattered palm trees in the vast emptiness of the central Pacific. To the northwest, beyond the curve of the earth, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, steamed toward Midway in perfect formation. Their decks trembled under the weight of dozens of Zero fighters and bombers, engines humming, ready to strike. Below deck, pilots checked their maps, their silk headbands tied tight. The Imperial Navy was confident. For 6 months they had crushed every opponent in their path. Today would be no different, or so they believed. Far below the horizon to the east, 3 American carriers waited. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, their task forces spread across hundreds of miles of sea. Hidden, silent, patient. Men slept beside their planes, others whispered last letters home. Somewhere deep in the dark, radar operators watched their screens flicker. A single blip appeared, then another. At 0430, the message crackled through the static. Enemy planes, heading Midway. Engines roared to life. Propellers spun. The calm was over. The Battle of Midway had begun, and with it, the fate of the Pacific would be rewritten. A world on fire in December 1941, the world had already been at war for over 2 years. Europe burned under the weight of Nazi occupation, and the Pacific, long a theater of colonial ambition and uneasy peace, exploded into chaos. The trigger came without warning, December 7, 1941, a Sunday morning in Hawaii. At 07:48 a.m., Japanese carrier-based aircraft descended upon Pearl Harbor in waves of precision and fury. In just 2 hours, they shattered the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Battleships burning, airfields smashed, thousands of men killed or wounded. The United States, once divided and uncertain, was instantly unified by rage. The next day, Congress declared war on Japan. Yet behind the flames of Oahu lay the mind of one man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy. A strategist with a gambler's instinct and a poet's understanding of tragedy, Yamamoto had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and knew the industrial power of America. His famous warning echoed among his staff. For 6 months after war begins, I will run wild. But after that, I have no expectation of success. Yamamoto's calculation was grimly precise. Japan could dominate early through speed, surprise, and ferocity. But if the United States recovered, its vast factories and shipyards would turn the tide. The only hope for Japan was to destroy America's ability to strike back before it could rebuild. And so, the empire struck hard and fast. The rising sun ascends in the months following Pearl Harbor. Japanese forces unleashed one of the most astonishing offensives in military history. From Hong Kong to Singapore, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, the rising sun advanced without pause. By March 1942, Japan had seized control of vast territories, securing vital oil fields, air bases, and naval outposts across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The Imperial Navy ruled the seas. Their carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, formed the most powerful striking force ever assembled. Their air crews were elite, battle-hardened, and meticulously trained in coordinated carrier operations. The Japanese Zero fighter was unmatched in agility and range. To many observers, Japan's dominance seemed absolute. The United States, by contrast, reeled in chaos. Battleships lay in ruin at Pearl Harbor. The Philippines, under General Douglas MacArthur, were collapsing. The Allies were retreating on all fronts. Yet in the midst of despair, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet on December 31, 1941. Calm, analytical, and quietly resolute, Nimitz faced a near-impossible task: rebuild a broken fleet, protect what remained, and somehow turn defense into offense. America rebuilds from the ashes. Pearl Harbor, though devastated, was not destroyed. Most of the sunken battleships would eventually rise again. The submarines, oil tanks, and repair yards had survived, a stroke of luck with enormous consequence. But for now, the war in the Pacific rested not on battleships, but on aircraft carriers, the new arbiters of naval warfare. By early 1942, Only 3 American carriers remained in the Pacific: Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga. Their air groups were small but determined. Commanders like Admiral William F. Bull Halsey and Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher led daring raids across the Pacific, striking at Japanese bases in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. These attacks inflicted little damage but carried great symbolic weight, proof that America was still fighting. Then came the first real challenge, the Battle of the Coral Sea, May 4 to 8, 1942. For the first time in history, 2 fleets clashed without ever seeing each other. Their aircraft fought the entire battle. The result was a costly draw, but strategically, a victory for the Allies. Japan's advance toward Port Moresby was stopped. However, the U.S. lost the carrier Lexington, and Yorktown limped home badly damaged. Still, something had changed. Japan's once invincible aura had cracked, and Yamamoto, now aware that the enemy could adapt, began planning his next move. A decisive strike meant to annihilate the remaining U.S. carriers once and for all. Yamamoto's grand gamble operation, the invasion of Midway, was conceived as the centerpiece of Yamamoto's grand strategy. Midway Atoll, a small but vital island 2,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, offered control of the Central Pacific. If captured, it would serve as a forward base to threaten Pearl Harbor itself and potentially lure the American fleet into battle on Japan's terms. Yamamoto's plan was bold, intricate, and fatally overcomplicated. He envisioned a massive operation involving 4 carriers, 2 battleship forces, cruisers, destroyers, and a separate diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands near Alaska. The goal? To stretch American forces thin and ambush their carriers when they rushed to defend Midway. The heart of his plan rested on surprise, the same element that had made Pearl Harbor a triumph. What Yamamoto did not know was that the Americans were no longer blind. The silent war of codes at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor. A small group of U.S. Navy cryptanalysts worked day and night to break the Japanese naval code JN-25. Among them was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a quiet, brilliant linguist and mathematician who often wore a smoking robe and slippers while working long nights in a converted basement. By late May 1942, Rochefort's team had uncovered fragments of messages suggesting that Japan was preparing a major operation against a target codenamed AF. But where was AF? Guesses ranged from the Aleutians to Fiji, until Rochefort proposed a clever deception. The garrison at Midway was instructed to send an uncoded radio message reporting a failure in its water distillation system. Soon after, Japanese intelligence transmitted, "AF is short of water." The trap had worked. F was Midway. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Nimitz made a decision that would define the war. He would not defend Midway passively. He would ambush the Japanese fleet. Preparing the ambush in secrecy, Nimitz gathered every available asset. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, were deployed northeast of Midway. Though Yorktown had been heavily damaged at Coral Sea, Pearl Harbor's shipyard crews worked around the clock. In just 72 hours, they patched holes, replaced boilers, and restored her to fighting condition. When she left harbor, sailors painted over the scars. But the steel still bore the memory of battle. On Midway itself, Marines fortified defenses. Airstrips were crowded with bombers and fighters, B-17s, PBY Catalinas, and Marine dive bombers, all ready for the inevitable onslaught. Across the Pacific, tension tightened like a drawn bowstring. The Japanese, unaware their codes had been broken, advanced confidently toward their fate. Yamamoto's forces were spread thin, divided across thousands of miles of ocean. His fleet believed it was marching into an easy victory against an inferior, unprepared enemy. But on the horizon, hidden among the waves, the hunters were already waiting. The calm of the Pacific would not last long. By dawn on June 4, 1942, the first aircraft engines began to roar. The storm was coming. The stage is set. The vastness of the Pacific concealed 2 great fleets moving toward collision. The Japanese combined fleet, Yamamoto's masterpiece, stretched across more than 1,000 miles of ocean. In his view, the American Navy was crippled, hesitant, and predictable. The plan, Operation MI, would finish what Pearl Harbor had begun. But Yamamoto's plan was a gamble wrapped in layers of complexity. He divided his power into too many parts: a fatal flaw born of overconfidence. The Aleutian diversion, the Midway invasion force, and the main carrier strike group were all scattered across the ocean, each unable to support the other in time. He assumed that secrecy and deception would protect him. He did not know that American intelligence already had his playbook. The Imperial Navy advances. By late May 1942, the Japanese fleet began to move. From Hashirajima, the four carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, steamed eastward with an escort of cruisers, destroyers, and oilers. Their decks carried more than 250 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. Nagumo, a cautious commander, had overseen the triumph at Pearl Harbor. Yet now his situation was far different. His air crews were tired from months of operations. Replacement pilots were scarce. The element of surprise, his greatest weapon, was slipping away. Behind Nagumo sailed the Midway invasion force, commanded by Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, carrying troops and landing craft. Further back, Yamamoto himself followed with the main body, the battleships Yamato, Nagato, and Mutsu, symbols of Japan's naval pride. To the north, another task force under Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosagaya moved toward the Aleutian Islands to attack Dutch Harbor and seize the islands of Attu and Kiska, a diversion meant to pull American forces away from Midway. But none of it would work as planned. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz studied the reports from Station Hypo. The intelligence was clear. The Japanese would attack Midway in early June. He would strike first. He positioned his limited carrier strength carefully. Task Force 16, under Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, aboard Enterprise and Hornet. Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, aboard Yorktown. These three carriers, supported by cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, took up position northeast of Midway, directly in the path of the Japanese fleet. They were outnumbered, but not outsmarted. Nimitz's plan depended on timing and patience. He would allow the Japanese to strike Midway first, exposing their carriers. Then, once Nagumo's decks were crowded with refueling and rearming planes, the American dive bombers would descend from the clouds and destroy them. It was a high-stakes trap, and everything hinged on intelligence, courage, and luck. Midway, the outpost in the storm. Midway itself was a lonely dot in the Pacific. Two small islands, Sand Island and Eastern Island, surrounded by coral reefs and turquoise water. Since 1940, the U.S. Navy had developed it into a forward base with runways, seaplane hangars, and anti-aircraft batteries. Now, it would be the anvil upon which Japan's ambitions might break. The garrison consisted of about 3,000 Marines, sailors, and airmen under Colonel Harold D. Shannon and Commander Cyril T. Simard. Their forces included Marine Air Group 22, F-2A Buffaloes and F-4F Wildcats, Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241, SB-2U Vindicators and SBD Dauntlesses, U.S. Army B-17 Flying Fortresses and a few B-26 Marauders, PBY Catalina flying boats for long-range reconnaissance. They were poorly equipped compared to the Japanese, but they were resolute. They had been warned. An attack was imminent. Every man knew what was coming. In the first days of June 1942, the Pacific was deceptively still. At Midway, the Marines dug deeper into their trenches. Anti-aircraft gunners scanned the horizon. Mechanics worked under the harsh sun to keep every plane flying. The tropical heat mixed with the smell of oil and sweat. Far out at sea, the American carrier crews prepared in silence. Pilots briefed their missions. Torpedo squadrons practiced launches on open water. In the cramped ready rooms, they joked quietly, some writing quick letters, words that would never be sent. Above them, Admiral Spruance stood on the flag bridge of Enterprise, calm and watchful. He was a surface officer, not a flyer, yet he carried the responsibility of hundreds of lives. Nimitz had chosen him carefully, logical, unflinching, and capable of acting under pressure. Fletcher, aboard Yorktown, was equally composed. His ship still bore the scars from the Coral Sea, patched bulkheads, scorched paint, twisted steel, but her spirit was unbroken. Engineers worked without rest to keep her seaworthy. To the men aboard, Yorktown was a wounded veteran returning to battle too soon. Meanwhile, aboard Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo reviewed his orders. His instructions were clear. Launch the first, wave against Midway at dawn on June 4th, to destroy its airfields and defenses, then prepare a second strike if necessary. But if enemy carriers were sighted, he was to prioritize them immediately. It was a recipe for chaos, conflicting priorities that would soon decide the outcome of the battle. At 0400 hours on June 4th, Nagumo's 4 carriers launched 108 aircraft, bombers and fighters bound for Midway. The sun was just beginning to rise behind them. Their engines thundered across the sea, leaving trails of vapor as they climbed. The attack was underway. Back on the carriers, crews began refueling and rearming planes for a potential second strike. Then at 0430, a Japanese scout plane from Tone, delayed by 30 crucial minutes, lifted off to search the waters east of the fleet. That delay would change everything. Long before the Japanese strike reached Midway, American patrol planes were already in the air. At 0530, a PBY Catalina spotted the incoming attack force and radioed the warning. Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320 degrees, distance 150 miles. The island's air raid sirens wailed. Marines ran to battle stations. The defenders scrambled every aircraft they had, fighters to intercept, bombers to strike the Japanese carriers. At nearly the same time, another Catalina sighted the Japanese main fleet, the carriers themselves. The coordinates were sent directly to Nimitz's carriers. The hunters now knew where the prey was. The first Japanese bombs fell on Midway around 0620 a.m. Explosions tore through runways and hangars. Fuel tanks erupted in flames. Yet the island's defenses remained functional. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with flak. Marine pilots fought desperately against superior Japanese Zeros, their outdated Buffaloes and Wildcats cut down one by one. From the air, Japanese Commander Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi reported back to Nagumo. Second attack required. Nagumo faced his critical decision. Should he prepare another strike on Midway, or arm his reserve planes with anti-ship weapons, in case American carriers were nearby? At that moment, no scout had yet found any enemy carriers. Believing the Americans were not present, Nagumo ordered his crews to rearm for a second strike against Midway. Below decks, bombs and torpedoes were moved, fuel lines were stretched, and planes were refitted, the decks filled with explosive chaos. Then at 0728, the delayed scout plane from Tone sent a message that froze the blood of the Japanese command staff. Enemy ships sighted. The message was incomplete, vague, and late, but it changed everything. Nagumo reversed his previous order, demanding his crews to rearm again, this time for ship attack. Hangars became dangerous mazes of bombs, torpedoes, and gasoline lines. In those critical minutes, Japanese carriers became floating powder kegs. High above them, the sky shimmered with sunlight. But the storm was coming. American bombers were already inbound. The trap Yamamoto had never imagined was about to spring. The sea, which had been calm at dawn, would soon boil with fire. The next hours would decide not just the fate of 4 carriers, but the balance of power in the entire Pacific. Courage. At the edge of the World War is fought by nations, but it is endured by men. At Midway, both sides carried the weight of their nation's hopes on their shoulders. For the Japanese, the attack was another step in an unstoppable march of empire. For the Americans, it was survival itself, the line between despair and the chance to strike back. On Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, thousands of sailors went about their routines with quiet precision. The air below decks was thick with the smell of fuel and sweat. In the hangars, crews worked in rhythm, each movement practiced to the second. Fueling, arming, folding wings, hoisting planes to the flight deck. Every man knew the odds. For the pilots, it was worse. They understood that their aircraft, the SBD Dauntless dive bomber, the TBD Devastator torpedo plane, were outclassed by Japanese Zeros. Their chances of survival were thin, but orders were orders. They would fly anyway. Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, leader of Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, aboard Hornet, had written to his family before departure. "My greatest hope is that I can prove worthy of the men I command." On the other side of the ocean, aboard Akagi and Kaga, young Japanese aviators prepared for their second wave. Many were veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, confident, disciplined, utterly loyal to their emperor. They had been taught that defeat was dishonor, and that death in battle was a noble end. As they stood by their aircraft, that morning, none knew that within hours most would vanish into the sea. Midway was not merely a battle between ships. It was a clash between technologies and doctrines. Before 1941, battleships ruled naval warfare, but after Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea, it was clear that aircraft carriers, floating airfields, now determined victory or defeat. The Japanese fleet carriers were superbly built. Akagi and Kaga, converted from battlecruiser and battleship hulls, carried large air groups and had hardened decks. Soryu and Hiryu were smaller, but faster. Together, they formed the First Air Fleet, or Kido Butai, the most powerful naval strike force in the world. Each carried roughly 70 to 80 aircraft: Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, Aichi D3A Val dive bombers, and Nakajima B5N Kate torpedo planes. Japanese pilots were among the best trained in the world. Their coordination, attack discipline, and combat experience from China and earlier campaigns were unmatched. Their weakness, however, was unseen. They had no replacement system. Japan's training program could not produce new pilots fast enough to replace losses. Every man lost at Midway would be irreplaceable. The Americans' carriers, though fewer, represented a different philosophy. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had smaller air groups, but they possessed radar, a technology Japan had yet to perfect. Radar pickets could detect incoming aircraft long before they arrived, allowing fighters to scramble early. The aircraft themselves were evolving. The Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber, though slower than the Japanese Val, was rugged and accurate. Its pilots trained to release bombs from near-vertical dives, trusting their altimeters more than their instincts. The Grumman F4F Wildcat, though inferior to the Zero in maneuverability, could outlast it with armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. The Americans were learning painfully and fast that endurance and information could beat speed and precision. The Battle of Midway was fought not only on the waves, but in the shadows of code and cipher. At Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team had done the impossible. They had broken the Japanese naval code JN-25, a task so complex it seemed almost miraculous. For months, the cryptographers had sifted through fragments of intercepted messages, isolated numbers, phrases, and call signs. They pieced together patterns like archaeologists reconstructing a shattered vase. Through exhaustion and intuition, they realized AF referred to Midway, but intelligence is only power if it is believed. Rochefort's findings were challenged by skeptics in Washington, who doubted his interpretation. Nimitz, however, trusted him. He knew that victory often depended on the courage to believe the improbable. When the deception about Midway's water shortage confirmed Rochefort's code-breaking, Nimitz acted decisively. He positioned his carriers where Yamamoto least expected them. In doing so, he reversed the dynamic of the Pacific War, turning the hunter into the hunted. The intelligence war also revealed another subtle truth. The Japanese, though disciplined and skilled, were blind to the fact that their codes could be compromised. They viewed American intelligence as inferior. This arrogance, when born of victory, became fatal. By June 3rd, Nimitz knew nearly everything about Japan's operation: the composition of their forces, the timing of their strike, even Yamamoto's presence at sea. Yamamoto, in contrast, knew almost nothing of Nimitz's plans. The Japanese still believed surprise was theirs, not realizing it had already been stolen. Fear is a constant companion in war, invisible, unspoken, yet felt by every man. For the Americans, Midway was a fight against not just an enemy fleet but the shadow of Pearl Harbor. Every sailor remembered the black smoke, the burning ships, the helplessness. The desire for revenge was real, but so was the fear of failure. On Yorktown, sailors slept beside their stations, knowing a single torpedo could end their lives. Pilots memorized escape procedures they might never use. Every mission could be their last. The ocean, flat and endless, offered no comfort, only the knowledge that beneath its surface lay graves without markers. For the Japanese, confidence bordered on fatalism. Their months of victories had fostered an unshakable belief in destiny. Many officers saw themselves as instruments of divine will, carrying out the emperor's expansion across Asia. They viewed Americans as soft, unprepared, and capable of sacrifice. But pride can be a dangerous armor. When cracked, it cuts deep. At Midway, that illusion of invincibility would shatter in a single morning, not because the Japanese fought poorly, but because war punishes certainty. Midway was also a reminder that war is not only a contest of skill, but of timing, luck, and coincidence. The American codebreaker's discovery depended on a hunch. The Tone scout plane, the one that sighted the U.S. fleet, had launched half an hour late. A single cloud layer shielded the American carriers from early detection. Even the dive bomber's arrival at the exact moment when Japanese decks were loaded with fuel and bombs was a convergence of near impossible circumstances. A few minutes earlier or later, and the outcome might have been reversed. Historians have called it the miracle at Midway. But miracles are simply the intersection of preparation and chance. The Americans had prepared, and the moment chance offered an opening, they struck with everything they had. The courage that defined Midway was not only in those who succeeded, but in those who perished before victory came. When the first American torpedo squadrons found the Japanese carriers that morning, they faced 0 fighters and walls of anti-aircraft fire. Not one bomber from Torpedo Squadron 8 survived. Every plane was shot down. Of the 30 men who flew with Waldron, 29 were killed. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating alone in the ocean, wounded, watching the rest of the battle unfold above him. Their attack failed to hit a single ship, but their sacrifice drew the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the sky above momentarily unguarded. It was that window, mere minutes, that allowed the U.S. dive bombers to strike from altitude and change history. Courage, in that moment, was measured not in success, but in persistence. The men of Midway, American and Japanese alike, fought not knowing they were part of a legend. They acted out of duty, fear, and faith in their comrades. They had no idea that their choices, their timing, and their deaths would alter the course of the Second World War. The battle lines were drawn, human, technological, and invisible. Every element, courage, code-breaking, machines, and luck, converged toward the same point in time. The storm that began over Midway would soon reach its violent crescendo, when the sky itself would burn and the Pacific would swallow giants. The leadership angle, 2 admirals, 2 visions. In the summer of 1942, the Pacific Ocean became a chessboard of human minds. At its center stood 2 commanders, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, men of opposite temperaments, training and philosophy, yet both defined by quiet intensity. Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's early triumphs, had always been a reluctant warrior. He had studied in America, spoke English fluently, and had visited Detroit's factories. He understood the might of U.S. industry and knew what war against such power meant. Yet loyalty bound him to his emperor, and duty chained him to victory, or death. He believed in boldness, in striking deep and hard to unnerve the enemy before the full weight of America could awaken. Pearl Harbor had proven him right, but Yamamoto also knew it was only the first hand in a longer gamble. Midway was his second throw of the dice. Across the ocean, Admiral Chester Nimitz, calm and methodical, represented a different kind of warrior. Where Yamamoto sought shock and awe, Nimitz sought patience and precision. A Texas-born submariner with a stoic smile and a mind like a slide rule, he valued intelligence, logistics, and timing above raw aggression. Nimitz's genius was not in emotion or inspiration, but in trust. He trusted men like Rochefort to break codes, Spruance to act decisively, and Fletcher to hold his nerve. He gave them freedom, and in return they gave him victory. If Yamamoto was a gambler, Nimitz was a mathematician. Midway would prove which form of calculation fate would reward. In the thick of battle, leadership passed from grand strategists to the men on deck. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carriers, was an experienced officer but no aviator. He had commanded surface ships for most of his career and approached carrier warfare with caution. At Pearl Harbor, his hesitancy after the first strike had prevented a second attack, a missed opportunity that haunted his subordinates. At Midway, he faced the same dilemma. Should he risk everything on a second wave against the island or keep his planes armed for the unknown threat of enemy carriers? His indecision would cost him everything. Nagumo's training had taught him discipline and hierarchy, not the improvisation that carrier warfare demanded. In contrast, Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance aboard Enterprise was a cruiser commander thrust into command of carriers after Halsey fell ill. Yet his lack of aviation background became an unexpected strength. He listened to his air officers, weighed every recommendation, and made decisions based on logic, not ego. When the moment to strike came, Spruance did not hesitate. His simplicity became clarity. His calm became control. Midway became his proving ground, and his success marked the rise of a new generation of American naval leaders. For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Empire had known only victory. Their banners flew over Manila, Singapore, Rangoon, and the East Indies. To their people, they were untouchable, their navy a divine arm of destiny. Yet that illusion had been built on a foundation of imbalance. Japan's industrial base could not sustain a long war. Its shipyards could not replace lost carriers. Its pilot training program was rigorous but slow, designed for peacetime perfection rather than wartime attrition. The Japanese Navy also suffered from a deeper flaw: overconfidence in its doctrine. Kido Butai's success at Pearl Harbor had convinced many that offense was the only form of defense. They expected the Americans to fight predictably, to come charging into the trap as they had before. No one imagined that Nimitz would already know their plan. When the first bombs fell on Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, disbelief spread through the fleet. Officers could not comprehend how the enemy had appeared so suddenly, at the worst possible moment. It felt to them as though the gods had turned away. Survivors would later describe the horror: decks erupting in flame, pilots screaming as munitions cooked off, the sky filled with smoke and fire. The Japanese Navy for the first time felt fear, not of defeat but of exposure. The myth of invincibility was gone. Midway is often remembered as a triumph of courage and strategy, but beneath the glory lies the moral weight of war, the choices, the lives, and the silence afterward. Both nations believed themselves righteous. Japan saw its expansion as liberation from Western imperialism, a new Asian order under its leadership. America saw its fight as defense against tyranny and aggression. Yet on the decks of ships, these ideas dissolved into the same human truths: fear, duty, and survival. Pilots did not think of ideology as they dived toward flaming carriers. Sailors did not ponder philosophy as they fought fires or pulled wounded comrades from the water. They acted because that was what was asked of them. When the Japanese carriers burned, thousands of men, engineers, gunners, mechanics, were trapped below decks. Many refused to abandon ship. They saluted their flags as flames consumed them. Some jumped into the sea and were lost beneath oil and wreckage. To their comrades, it was not simply defeat, it was erasure. On the American side, the cost was heavy too. Dozens of aircraft vanished. Entire squadrons were wiped out. For every victory, there was the quiet, aching absence of those who never returned. Midway's triumph was paid for with youth and blood. War reveals not just courage, but contradiction. How triumph can coexist with tragedy. How victory can feel hollow when weighed against loss. The Battle of Midway stands as a case study in the art of calculated risk. Yamamoto's plan was audacious but too intricate to execute flawlessly. His forces were spread too wide. Communication delays crippled his timing. He sought total control, and yet in seeking it, he created chaos. Nimitz, on the other hand, accepted uncertainty. He understood that perfect knowledge was impossible, but enough knowledge could shape destiny. By trusting incomplete intelligence and acting decisively, he demonstrated a rare mastery of risk. It was not courage that won Midway, it was clarity under pressure. Where Yamamoto hesitated to adapt, Nimitz and his subordinates improvised. War rewards the side that adapts faster to the unexpected. At Midway, Japan clung to a doctrine that had already expired. America embraced a new one that saw warfare as a dynamic system of information, mobility, and timing. That shift would define the next 3 years of the Pacific War. For the Japanese, defeat at Midway was not just military, it was spiritual. Bushido, the code of the warrior, emphasized loyalty, honor, and the acceptance of death. When defeat came, it was internalized as shame. Commanders who survived often chose suicide rather than live with dishonor. The burning of Akagi and Kaga was more than the loss of ships. It was the unraveling of faith. Men who had believed themselves chosen by the gods of war now faced the unthinkable truth. Fate had turned its back. For the Americans, the victory was transformative. It was proof that resilience could overcome devastation, that intelligence and sacrifice could restore balance. Yet even amid celebration there was no joy, only relief. Those who survived carried the memory of burning seas and falling comrades for the rest of their lives. Midway was not a triumph of glory, it was a triumph of endurance. By the end of June 4, 1942, leadership, belief, and moral conviction had collided in the crucible of the Pacific. The skies were scorched, the sea littered with wreckage, and thousands of men, Japanese and American, were gone. The battle's outcome would soon crystallize in a single, irreversible moment, the burning of 4 Japanese carriers in the space of an hour. The turning point of the war was at hand. June 4, 1942, Odo 6:30 hours. Midway Atoll. The horizon was alive with movement. Waves rippled under the passage of Japanese aircraft. Nearly 108 planes from Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu sweeping toward Midway Island. Their mission: annihilate the American base and soften defenses for invasion. Below, on the tiny airstrips of Midway, U.S. Marines and Navy crews scrambled. Sirens wailed through the humid air. Pilots rushed to their aircraft, Wildcats, Buffaloes, and dauntless bombers. Dust and coral debris whipped through the air as propellers spun to life. When the first Japanese bombs fell, the island shuddered. Explosions tore into hangars and fuel tanks. Flames leapt skyward, black smoke rising like signal columns. Anti-aircraft guns fired wildly, tracers streaking across the morning light. Japanese Zeros swooped low, strafing anything that moved, but the defenders held their ground. Though battered, Midway did not fall. The Japanese commander of the air group, Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi, radioed back a message that would change the course of history. Second strike required to complete destruction. That single sentence would seal the fate of the Imperial Navy. 7:15. The fatal delay aboard. The Japanese flagship Akagi. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo received Tomonaga's message. His situation was complex. His first wave was returning low on fuel. His reserve planes were armed with torpedoes for naval engagement, and reconnaissance reports on enemy carriers were unclear. Nagumo faced a choice: rearm his reserve planes with bombs to strike Midway again, or wait for confirmation of enemy ships. He chose to rearm. Below deck, hundreds of men began the laborious process of unloading torpedoes, hauling them away and fitting new bombs for a second land attack. Fuel lines snaked across the hangar decks. Bombs lay open on the floor and aircraft were moved in tight formation. The decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu became floating powder magazines. At that exact moment, hundreds of miles to the east, American carrier aircraft were already in the air, closing fast. Bang. The search and the gamble Admiral Chester Nimitz had committed nearly everything. From Enterprise and Hornet, 2 full waves of aircraft had launched before dawn. From the damaged Yorktown, another group took off soon after. Navigation errors and communication failures would scatter them across hundreds of miles. Yet fate, or sheer persistence, would guide some to their targets. The first to find the Japanese were the torpedo squadrons. VT-8 from Hornet, VT-6 from Enterprise, and VT-3 from Yorktown. Outdated TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, slow and vulnerable, lumbered toward the enemy without fighter escort. At 09:20, VT-8 sighted the Japanese fleet. Commander John C. Waldron, leading 15 Devastators, broke radio silence. "We'll go in. We'll attack." Every one of his planes went in low under heavy anti-aircraft fire. Zeros pounced from above, tearing the formation apart. One by one, the Devastators exploded or plunged into the sea. All 15 were lost. Only one man survived, Ensign George Gay, who drifted in the water and would later witness the destruction of the Japanese carriers with his own eyes. Moments later, VT-6 and VT-3 met the same fate. Of 41 torpedo planes that attacked, 35 were shot down. None scored a hit, but their sacrifice achieved what radar and planning could not. It pulled every Japanese fighter down to sea level. The skies above, once a fortress of zeros, were suddenly open. Can 20, the dive bombers arrived from the clear blue sky above 20,000 feet. 2 squadrons of Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise in Yorktown appeared, almost by accident. Led by Commander Clarence W. McCluskey, the pilots had been searching desperately for hours. Fuel was running low. Many considered turning back. But McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer, Arashi, racing north at full speed. It was trying to rejoin the main fleet after attacking an American submarine. McCluskey made a fateful decision to follow it. The destroyer's wake led straight to Nagumo's carriers. At 10:22, the Dauntless bombers emerged from the clouds. Below them, the Japanese carriers were turning into the wind, decks crowded with planes, bombs, and fuel hoses. It was the most vulnerable moment imaginable. McCluskey gave the signal. Dive brakes opened. The sky filled with the scream of descending aircraft from 15,000 feet. They plunged almost vertically while one after another cut into the chaos below and tore. Hell from above Akagi, Kaga and Soryu were caught completely unprepared. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire too late. The first bomb struck Kaga's flight deck, igniting parked aircraft and detonating munitions. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. Another group hit Akagi. One bomb through the flight deck, exploding in the hangar below, triggering a chain reaction of fires. Within minutes, the ship was a firestorm. On Soryu, 3 direct hits set off fuel tanks. Pilots and deck crews were incinerated where they stood. The carrier's bridge melted under the heat. In less than 5 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 3 of its 4 frontline carriers, the core of its naval aviation power. Smoke columns rose into the sky, visible for miles. Japanese sailors leapt into the sea, oil fires spreading across the surface. Some clung to debris. Others simply disappeared beneath the waves. For Nagumo, it was devastation beyond comprehension. He had gone from orchestrating victory to watching the heart of his fleet burn. His flagship Akagi was abandoned by noon. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. The surviving carrier. Hiryu, but the battle was not yet over. To the north, the 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, remained untouched. Her commander, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, refused to retreat. His resolve was pure and absolute. Japan's honor demanded retribution. At 10:45, Hiryu launched her first counterstrike. 18 dive bombers roared toward the nearest American carrier, Yorktown. They came out of the sun. Anti-aircraft guns thundered. 2 bombs hit. One tore through the flight deck, another exploded below. Within minutes, Yorktown was engulfed in smoke and flames. Yet her crew fought the fires fiercely. Within an hour, they restored power and prepared for flight operations again. At 14:30, a second strike from Hiryu arrived, this time torpedo bombers. They attacked in a textbook pincer, 2 groups converging from opposite directions. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's side. The ship listed sharply, power failed, and her engines died. By mid-afternoon, Yorktown was dead in the water. Her crew abandoned ship, though she refused to sink. For a brief moment, it seemed Hiryu had balanced the scales, but American scouts had already spotted her position. Cheeky, the final blow. As the sun lowered, dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet found Hiryu steaming north at high speed. The ship's decks were clear, her planes away, her crew preparing for recovery. At 17:03, the first bomb struck. 4 direct hits. Explosions ripped through the flight deck and below. Flames reached her bridge. Admiral Yamaguchi remained aboard, refusing evacuation. He told his captain, Tamankaku, "Let us sink together with our ship. It is beautiful to die with our company." By nightfall, Hiryu burned fiercely against the darkening horizon. At dawn on June 5th, she rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, gone. 1 battle, 1 morning, 1 irreversible shift in history. The skies over Midway, once ruled by the rising sun, were now filled with the smoke of defeat. For Japan, it was the beginning of an ending. For America, it was the moment when survival turned into momentum, when the hunted became the hunter. June 4th, 1942. Evening falls on the Pacific, as darkness crept over the ocean. The fires of 4 Japanese carriers burned like floating volcanoes across the horizon. The sea glowed faintly red beneath the smoke. From Enterprise and Hornet, American pilots circled above the wreckage, some in silence, others murmuring disbelief. Hours earlier, the Imperial Navy had dominated the Pacific. Now its mightiest ships were crippled and sinking. Yet no one aboard the U.S. fleet celebrated. Every man understood what it had cost. Of 41 torpedo bombers sent against the Japanese that morning, only a handful had returned. Entire squadrons had vanished into the sea, but their courage had opened the skies for the dive bombers that changed history. At dusk, Admiral Raymond Spruance ordered his carriers to turn east. The Americans had struck hard. Now they had to survive the night of uncertainty. The ocean between the two fleets was vast but filled with tension. Both sides believed the other might strike again before dawn. American radar was still primitive. Japanese destroyers prowled the dark waters, searching for survivors and enemies alike. On board Enterprise, crews worked through the night, repairing aircraft, refueling, tending the wounded. The smell of oil and sweat mixed with salt air. Below deck, exhausted pilots slumped beside their planes. Some still wore life vests, expecting another alarm. Spruance faced a difficult decision. Should he chase the retreating Japanese fleet under cover of darkness or hold position until daylight? He chose restraint. A night engagement risked everything. His ships had done their part. Now he would let attrition and intelligence do the rest. Far to the west, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto listened to the reports in silence. 4 carriers, gone. Over 300 aircraft, destroyed. The pride of the Imperial Navy, obliterated in a single day. His staff waited for orders. Yamamoto's expression did not change. Calmly, he instructed the fleet to regroup. A surface attack was still possible. But the distance was too great, and the risk immense. The element of surprise was gone. At 02:55, Yamamoto gave the final command. Operation to be terminated. All forces withdraw. The dream of naval dominance had died before sunrise. June 5, 1942. The end of Hiryu, when dawn broke. A black column of smoke still trailed from the horizon where Hiryu had burned through the night. The destroyer Makigumo remained nearby, rescuing survivors from the carrier's oily waters. On her deck stood Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, gravely wounded but calm. His ship was beyond saving. Fires raged uncontrollably below. The order came to abandon ship. Yamaguchi refused. He turned to his crew and said quietly, "I will remain with the ship. Those who wish to go, go." Captain Kaku saluted. He chose to stay as well. At 05:10, Makigumo fired a torpedo into the crippled carrier's hull. Moments later, Hiryu erupted in one last fireball and slipped beneath the waves. The last of Yamamoto's 4 carriers was gone. The Japanese flag vanished into the deep. The vanishing fleet by mid-morning, Spruance sent search planes westward, hoping to locate the Japanese main body. They found only scattered ships, destroyers picking up survivors, cruisers limping away. The once formidable Kido Butai was shattered. The Americans considered pursuit, but fuel was running low and aircraft losses were severe. Spruance chose to preserve his carriers. "We've accomplished what we came for," he remarked to his staff. "No sense chasing ghosts." The Japanese fleet withdrew under cover of storms, retreating toward Japan in silence. On board their remaining ships, hundreds of rescued sailors lined the decks, wrapped in blankets, staring into the sea where their comrades had perished. The Imperial Navy's creed, "Strike first, strike hard, never yield," had met an opponent that fought with patience, intelligence, and courage. The fate of Yorktown, meanwhile, the American carrier Yorktown, crippled but afloat, had become a ghost ship. After being abandoned, she drifted, listing heavily but stubbornly refusing to sink. Admiral Fletcher hoped to save her. The fleet tug Vireo was sent to tow the carrier, while destroyers circled protectively. Damage control teams reboarded the ship, fighting fires and patching hull breaches. By June 6th, it seemed possible that Yorktown could be saved. But beneath the waves, danger lurked. At noon, Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, slipped through the American screen. The periscope rose briefly. The outline of Yorktown filled the lens. At 15:36, Tanabe fired 4 torpedoes. 2 struck the carrier. A third hit the destroyer Hammond, which was alongside, sending her to the bottom in seconds. Yorktown rolled slowly, flames spreading once more. Her recovery was over. At dawn on June 7th, she finally capsized and sank. Her crew, watching from nearby ships, saluted as she went down. June 6th, 7. Silence and reckoning. June 6th, the battle was officially over. The Americans held the sea. The Japanese, once invincible, had retreated beyond reach. Reports filtered through both navies, incomplete, confused, unbelievable. Many aboard U.S. ships refused to believe that 4 carriers had truly been sunk until confirmation arrived. When it did, the reaction was not celebration but quiet astonishment. Vice Admiral Halsey, recovering in a Pearl Harbor hospital, sent Spruance a single line: "Well done. The Navy's future is secure." In Tokyo, however, the news was received with disbelief. At first, official communiques claimed minor losses. Only later did the scale of the disaster become undeniable. The Japanese public would not learn the full truth for months. Yamamoto, upon hearing confirmation, was said to have stood motionless for several minutes, then whispered, "I had not wished for war with America, and now we have lost it." The strategic collapse Midway did more than sink 4 ships. It shattered Japan's ability to wage offensive war. Each carrier lost represented not just steel and machinery, but irreplaceable air crews, the elite, highly trained core of Japanese naval aviation. Japan could build new ships, but not new veterans. Before Midway, Japan could project power across the Pacific. After Midway, it fought merely to defend what it had taken. The Imperial Navy had planned to lure the Americans into a trap, yet it was they who had been ensnared by intelligence, timing, and fate. The balance of naval power shifted in a single day. For the first time, the initiative, when the future, belonged to the United States. A sea of wreckage and ghosts. When the smoke cleared, the Pacific was littered with reminders of what had been lost. Oil slicks stretched for miles. Life rafts drifted aimlessly. The cries of the wounded faded into the wind. American rescue planes searched for hours, picking up survivors from both sides. Many Japanese sailors refused help, choosing instead to slip beneath the waves. For them, capture meant dishonor. Those rescued were silent. They did not curse their enemies or plead for mercy. They simply stared into the distance, their faces blank. The enormity of loss beyond words. The Pacific had swallowed 4 carriers, thousands of men, and an empire's illusion of invincibility. The turning of the tide on June 7th. As the surviving American ships turned home, the ocean lay strangely calm. The wind had shifted east. The sea, once filled with fire, now reflected only the morning light. In the command room of Enterprise, Spruance looked over the reports. He had lost 150 planes, 307 men. Japan had lost 4 carriers, over 300 planes, and more than 3,000 men. When asked what he would tell Admiral Nimitz, Spruance replied simply, "Tell him we were lucky." Nimitz, reading the message in Pearl Harbor, smiled faintly and said, "Luck favors the prepared." Midway was not just a victory. It was the moment when America seized the initiative, when intelligence, courage, and sacrifice converged to alter the destiny of a world at war. The sun set on June 7th over a quiet Pacific. The fires had burned out, the sea had claimed its dead, and both nations knew that nothing would ever be the same again. For Japan, the road ahead would be one of defense, desperation, and decline. For the United States, Midway marked the first step on a long and costly road toward ultimate victory. From that day onward, the Pacific belonged not to the rising sun, but to the storm that had risen to oppose it. The morning after victory, June 8, 1942. The Pacific Ocean was quiet again. The thunder of war had faded into the sound of waves brushing against steel hulls. The American carriers Enterprise and Hornet steamed eastward, their decks littered with the scars of battle. Bullet holes, burned paint, fragments of shattered aircraft. Sailors walked silently, exhausted, hollow-eyed, yet aware they had lived through history. The U.S. Navy had not only survived, it had prevailed. The impossible had happened. 4 of Japan's most powerful carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone. Admiral Nimitz's telegram to Washington was concise, almost restrained. Present enemy losses believed to be 4 CVs. Our losses 1 CV damaged and sunk later. The United States Navy is still in action. At Pearl Harbor, when that message arrived, the base erupted in stunned applause. Officers who had witnessed the December 7th attack, the humiliation that had brought the nation to war, now read the words again and again. 4 carriers sunk. It felt almost unreal. The United States had not merely avenged Pearl Harbor, it had reversed the tide of the entire Pacific War. The strategic impact, Japan's irreplaceable. Loss for Japan, Midway was more than a defeat. It was a strategic catastrophe. The Imperial Navy's offensive power had been gutted in a single engagement. The 4 carriers destroyed at Midway represented 2/3 of Japan's frontline carrier strength, ships that had led every major victory since the war began. Each carrier lost carried not just aircraft, but the most experienced pilots, deck crews, and maintenance specialists in the Empire. Nearly all were gone, burned, drowned, or missing. The Japanese pilot training program, renowned for its rigor, was also its weakness. It produced elite aviators, but too slowly to replace them. By 1942, each graduate required over 700 flight hours. The process took years, not months. America, by contrast, was training hundreds of new pilots every week. Yamamoto understood this difference better than anyone. He had once warned his government that Japan could fight victoriously for 6 months, but not longer. Midway marked the end of that prophecy. Exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy had lost the war's initiative. A new balance in the Pacific. Until Midway, Japan had dictated the tempo of the war. Its Navy chose when and where to strike, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies to the Indian Ocean. After Midway, that power vanished. With the loss of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, Japan could no longer launch large-scale offensive operations. The proposed invasions of Fiji, Samoa, and even Hawaii were abandoned. Instead, the empire turned inward, shifting from expansion to defense. The Americans, once scrambling to hold the line, now began to plan counteroffensives. In the war rooms of Pearl Harbor, Nimitz's staff pinned new charts to the walls. The next target was already under consideration: the Solomon Islands, and a small, obscure jungle island called Guadalcanal. The momentum had shifted permanently. The human cost, heroes and ghosts' victory at Midway, came at a terrible price. Over 300 Americans had been killed. The carrier Yorktown and destroyer Hammond were lost. Entire squadrons of torpedo bombers, VT-8, VT-6, VT-3, had been annihilated. For their comrades, grief mixed with pride. The torpedo pilots' doomed attacks had drawn down Japanese fighters, clearing the skies for the dive bombers that delivered the killing blow. Their sacrifice had been the hinge upon which victory turned. One survivor, Ensign George Gay, drifted for hours in the open sea, watching the battle unfold. He saw Akagi and Kaga erupt in flame. He saw men leaping from the burning decks. When a PBY Catalina finally rescued him the next day, he was the only living member of Torpedo Squadron 8. His words to reporters were simple: "I was lucky. The others weren't." For Japan, the human toll was even greater. Over 3,000 men died with their ships: pilots, mechanics, signalmen, cooks, and officers. The best of Japan's naval airmen were gone. Their loss struck the Japanese Navy at its heart. Many of the men who had bombed Pearl Harbor perished at Midway. The veterans who might have trained a new generation were now ashes beneath the Pacific. Psychological shock. From invincibility to doubt in Tokyo, the first reports from Midway were muted. The Imperial Navy's Communications Bureau issued vague statements: a fierce engagement, losses under investigation. But within days, whispers spread through the military hierarchy. Something catastrophic had happened. When the truth reached Emperor Hirohito, he received it in silence. His admirals bowed deeply, unable to meet his gaze. For the Japanese people, raised on months of triumph and propaganda, the concept of defeat was unthinkable. The official announcement minimized the disaster, claiming only that 1 or 2 carriers had been lost. Newspapers printed heroic accounts of pilots dying for the emperor, but among the officers who knew the truth, the mood was grim. Midway had shattered Japan's aura of invincibility. The navy that had ruled the Pacific was now vulnerable, and they knew it. Many officers, including survivors of the carrier crews, would later describe a haunting sense of foreboding. One recalled, "We felt that something inside us had broken. We had believed that the empire could not be defeated. Midway proved that belief false." Admiral Yamamoto's silent reckoning aboard the battleship Yamato, anchored at Hashirajima in the inland sea. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto spent the days after Midway in seclusion. He reviewed battle reports, read after-action notes, and said little. The disaster was his responsibility. He had conceived the plan, chosen the commanders, and approved the risks. He had believed intelligence and audacity would ensure victory. Instead, they had delivered destruction. Yamamoto was not relieved of command, and the emperor still respected him, but he understood the truth. His strategic freedom was gone. The Navy could no longer afford bold offensives. Every ship, every plane, every pilot would now be precious. He reportedly told an aide, "Japan has lost the war. It will take us some time to admit it." Admiral Nimitz and the American ascendancy at Pearl Harbor. Nimitz received the detailed battle report with quiet satisfaction. He had gambled everything on code-breaking, timing, and trust in his subordinates. Now that gamble had paid off beyond expectation. But his victory message to Washington was modest. He praised his pilots and crews, especially the men who had not returned. There was no boast, no triumphalism. Nimitz knew this was only the beginning. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt received word of the victory, he called it our most important naval victory since Trafalgar. The press echoed his sentiment. Headlines proclaimed, "Japan's Navy smashed." But Nimitz reminded his staff, this is not the end. It is the turning of the tide. The American public, still reeling from months of losses, finally felt hope. For the first time, the word victory carried substance. The tactical lessons Midway redefined naval warfare. It proved that air power, not battleships, would decide the fate of nations. The age of the carrier had arrived. Before Midway, many in both navies still saw carriers as support units for surface fleets. After Midway, their supremacy was undeniable. The battle demonstrated how aircraft, operating from hundreds of miles away, could determine outcomes long before fleets sighted each other. It also revealed the growing importance of intelligence, communication, and adaptability. Where the Japanese had relied on rigid doctrine and perfect coordination, the Americans had embraced flexibility, trusting initiative, intuition, and luck. The lessons of Midway would shape every major Pacific operation that followed, from the Solomons to the Marianas to Leyte Gulf. By June's end, the ocean around Midway had returned to silence. The wrecks of 4 Japanese carriers lay deep beneath the waves, their steel hulls already home to coral and fish. But above the surface, their ghosts still shaped the war. From this point onward, Japan would fight with dwindling resources, while America would grow stronger with each passing month. The balance had shifted, permanently. The beginning of Japan's decline after Midway. Japan never recovered its offensive momentum. The Imperial Navy remained formidable, but its power was hollow. A fleet without air cover, a sword without its edge. In the months following the battle, the Japanese shipyards worked tirelessly. New carriers were laid down, replacements planned. Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, and Hio were among the few remaining operational carriers. Yet the loss of trained pilots was irreversible. Ships could be rebuilt. Men like the veterans of Akagi and Kaga could not. The fleet's next major operation, the defense of Guadalcanal, revealed the depth of that wound. Japanese air groups, once precise and deadly, now struggled with inexperience and exhaustion. Every battle cost more aircraft and pilots that Japan could not spare. In contrast, the United States surged forward. By late 1943, America had dozens of new carriers, Essex-class giants and smaller escort carriers, launching hundreds of new planes every week. The Pacific sky, once ruled by the rising sun, now filled with the roar of American engines. Midway had not just changed a battle, it had rewritten the entire balance of industrial warfare. The Industrial War, America's arsenal awakens in 1941. Japan's military-industrial complex could match or surpass America's regional strength. By 1943, it was dwarfed. In the aftermath of Midway, the U.S. accelerated production beyond anything the world had ever seen. American factories launched new carriers faster than Japan could replace aircraft. Detroit produced engines and bombers at a rate that stunned even military planners. And behind every warship and aircraft stood an industrial empire: engineers, welders, machinists, and women working around the clock in factories from California to Pennsylvania. Each of Japan's 4 lost carriers had required years to construct. By contrast, American shipyards could complete an Essex-class carrier in less than 18 months. Midway was the moment the U.S. realized it could outbuild, outtrain, and outlast its enemy. From this understanding came the doctrine that would define the remainder of the Pacific Campaign: relentless, overwhelming production, pushing forward island by island until the Japanese homeland itself lay within reach. Intelligence, the invisible weapon. The victory at Midway also validated the power of intelligence, a weapon unseen, yet decisive. The success of Admiral Nimitz's ambush had hinged on the brilliance of Station Hypo, the Navy's code-breaking unit at Pearl Harbor. Led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, the cryptanalysts had decrypted just enough of the Japanese JN-25 naval code to identify AF as Midway. Their plan to confirm it, the now famous water shortage ruse, had been a triumph of intellect over secrecy. After the battle, the U.S. Navy finally acknowledged the full strategic importance of signals intelligence. Funds, personnel, and resources poured into cryptographic programs, laying the foundation for modern electronic warfare. From that moment on, code-breaking became a permanent pillar of American strategy, used in every major operation that followed, including the campaigns in the Solomons, the Marianas, and even the hunt for Yamamoto himself in 1943. Japan, by contrast, failed to recognize how deeply its communications had been compromised. Its codes changed slowly, and even as losses mounted, its leadership never fully grasped how the Americans seemed to anticipate every move. Midway proved that victory no longer depended solely on guns and ships, but on information. The evolution of carrier warfare, the Battle of Midway marked a technological and tactical revolution. Before it, both sides still considered battleships as the ultimate measure of naval power. After it, that era was finished. The engagement had shown that fleets could strike each other from beyond the horizon, never exchanging a single shell. The aircraft carrier had become the new capital ship, its aircraft the decisive arm of destruction. The U.S. Navy absorbed these lessons with speed and precision. Carrier task forces were reorganized around fast carriers, supported by destroyer screens, refueling ships, and radar-equipped command vessels. New doctrines emphasized coordinated strike waves, radar-directed interception, and centralized command. Innovations that would reach their zenith in 1944's Battle of the Philippine Sea. Midway's survivors, men like Raymond Spruance, Wade McCluskey, and Mark Mitcher, became the architects of this new naval age. Their experience in the chaos of June 1942 shaped a generation of American naval thought. For Japan, adaptation came too late. Its remaining carriers lacked the planes and pilots to test new tactics. The empire that had once pioneered carrier warfare had now been overtaken by the student. Yamamoto's decline and death in the year following Midway. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto continued to lead the combined fleet, but the spark of confidence that once defined him was gone. He threw himself into planning new operations, desperate attempts to regain the initiative. Yet every effort met growing American strength. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted a message detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour in the Solomon Islands. Acting on this intelligence, a squadron of P-38 Lightning fighters ambushed his plane over Bougainville. Yamamoto's aircraft crashed into the jungle, killing him instantly. It was a symbolic end. The mastermind of Pearl Harbor and Midway, the man who had foreseen both victory and defeat, died because of the same intelligence network that had undone his greatest plan. His death further weakened Japan's naval leadership. What replaced him was bureaucracy, a cautious command unwilling to take risks, yet incapable of innovation. A turning point in morale and strategy for the American people, Midway became more than a military victory. It was a psychological turning point. In 1942, the nation had endured 6 months of loss after loss. The Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, all had fallen. Midway was the first signal that Japan could be beaten, that the tide could truly turn. It revitalized confidence across the Allied world. Newspapers printed maps showing the Pacific in red and blue, marking the first patch of ocean reclaimed by the United States. Within military circles, it became a lesson in perseverance, a testament to what coordination, intelligence, and courage could achieve even under desperate odds. In Japan, the opposite occurred. For the first time, civilians heard whispers of doubt. Soldiers and sailors who returned from the front spoke cautiously of heavy losses, of American strength, of endless planes and ships. The myth of inevitable victory began to erode. By 1943, the empire's propaganda grew strained, its tone defensive. The war was no longer one of expansion, but of endurance. Long shadow, Midway in retrospect as historians later examined the Pacific War. Midway emerged as its hinge point, the precise moment when the strategic balance shifted irreversibly. Before Midway, Japan expanded. After Midway, Japan retreated. It was not the largest naval battle nor the bloodiest, but it was the most consequential. Every subsequent American victory, Guadalcanal, the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, the Marianas, Leyte Gulf, and was made possible because Midway halted Japan's expansion and broke its carrier arm. The 4 carriers sunk there, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, symbolized the end of Japan's dreams of dominance. Their wrecks, resting miles beneath the Pacific, became tombs of an empire that had reached too far. Legacy and memory decades later. When explorers found the remains of the Japanese carriers deep under the Pacific, they discovered something haunting. Flight decks twisted but still recognizable, aircraft resting silently on the seabed, propellers half buried in sand. The wrecks told a story not just of defeat but of courage on both sides, of men who fought in machines made of steel and fire, believing utterly in their cause. At the U.S. Naval Academy, the names of Midway's fallen aviators are etched into memorials. In Japan, remembrance remains quieter, focused on sacrifice rather than victory. Yet in both nations, Midway stands as a monument to the cost of war and the fine line between triumph and annihilation. From Midway to the future, the echoes of Midway shaped the modern world. It accelerated the rise of the aircraft carrier as the centerpiece of naval power, a legacy that endures into the 21st century. It reinforced the value of intelligence and information as decisive tools of warfare. And it marked the birth of a new American role, as a Pacific power destined to shape global balance for generations. From the smoke of that June morning came a new understanding. Victory was not won by numbers alone, but by the will to adapt faster than one's enemy. The ocean that had once belonged to Japan now belonged to no one, and to everyone. The Pacific had changed forever. The calm after Midway was deceptive. The storm of the Pacific War was only gathering strength. From the ashes of those carriers, new strategies and rivalries would rise. But for that brief moment in June 1942, amid the drifting oil and flame, history itself had turned. The sea remembers if you sail to the coordinates northwest of Midway Atoll today, 30° north, 178° west, the ocean is calm. The waves roll gently, the wind drifts in quiet sighs, and beneath that vast blue emptiness lies a graveyard. 4 steel leviathans, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, rest there in eternal silence. Their once proud flight decks, scorched and torn, now serve as coral reefs. Fish glide through twisted beams where once men shouted orders and planes thundered into the sky. No banners remain, no noise, no glory, only the slow pulse of the sea. 80 years later, the Pacific still carries the memory of June 1942, not in its sound, but in its stillness. It is a silence that speaks of courage, sacrifice, and the fragile nature of human ambition. The Battle of Midway was not just a clash of navies. It was the moment when the tides of history, industry, and fate converged, when the will of empires met the limits of human endurance. The turning of an age. Midway ended more than a campaign. It ended an era. Before it, the world still lived in the shadow of battleships, empires, and the belief that nations could rule by force of steel. After it, warfare entered a new dimension, one defined by range, speed, and information. The aircraft carrier became the new symbol of power. From that day onward, every major navy reshaped itself around floating airfields. Battles were no longer decided by the number of guns, but by who saw first, who struck first, and who adapted faster. It was the dawn of the information age in warfare, long before computers or satellites. Midway was fought and won not only with bombs but with intelligence, timing, and trust. It was proof that victory could depend as much on the mind as on the machine. In that sense, Midway marked humanity's first step toward the modern concept of war, where code breakers, analysts, and unseen signals could decide the fate of nations. Courage in the face of hopelessness. For those who fought at Midway, courage meant something different than glory. It meant flying into the unknown, often with no expectation of return. When the men of Torpedo Squadron 8 launched their attack, they knew the odds. Their outdated devastators were slow and vulnerable. Their mission, a near-suicide charge, was to draw the enemy's fire. Yet not one of them turned back. Every pilot pressed on through clouds of gunfire until the sea consumed them. Their attack failed tactically, but it opened the door to victory. By forcing the Japanese combat air patrols low and wide, those doomed Americans gave the dive bombers a clear path to the carriers. History rarely remembers courage in such raw form, unadorned, unseen, and unrewarded. But Midway does. The names of those who fell are carved into history not for what they destroyed, but for what they endured. Their sacrifice is the invisible foundation upon which the triumph stands. The cost of arrogance. For Japan, Midway was a lesson in hubris. In 6 months, the Imperial Navy had conquered half the Pacific. Its victories at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Indian Ocean had seemed unstoppable. Confidence turned to complacency, and complacency to disaster. Admiral Yamamoto's plan, brilliant on paper, suffered from a fatal flaw. It assumed the enemy would act as expected. When the Americans did not, the entire operation unraveled. Midway revealed a truth as old as war itself, that arrogance blinds even the most disciplined power. Japan's leadership had believed in its own myth of invincibility. The result was not just defeat but exposure, the realization that an empire built on belief could crumble when belief met reality. In that sense, Midway was not only a tactical failure, but a moral reckoning. It forced Japan to confront the limits of its destiny, and it forced the world to see how pride can destroy even the strongest. Fate and chance. Every great battle carries an element of chance. At Midway, fate played its quiet hand again and again, the American dive bombers arriving at the precise moment when Japanese decks were refueling. Wade McCluskey spotting the wake of the Arashi destroyer and following it straight to the carriers. The single minute when 3 bombs changed the course of the Pacific War. Had any of these moments shifted by minutes, even seconds, the outcome might have been different. Yet chance alone does not decide history. It was human resolve, preparation, and intuition that allowed luck to matter. Nimitz trusted his codebreakers. Spruance trusted his pilots. McCluskey trusted his instincts. Midway reminds us that luck favors those who dare, but also those who listen, think, and adapt. It was not simply a miracle. It was the intersection of preparation and opportunity, of human intelligence meeting the unpredictable rhythm of war, the silent battles. After, for those who survived Midway, the war continued, long, brutal, and unrelenting. Many of the same men who fought there would later serve at Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, and Okinawa. They carried with them the ghosts of that June morning, the faces of comrades lost over the Pacific, the smell of burning oil, the memory of flames reaching the sky. When the war finally ended in 1945, few celebrated Midway as a victory. They saw it instead as a beginning, the first step on a road paved with millions of lives. Victory, they understood, had a cost measured not in medals but in absence. Midway may have turned the tide, but it also revealed the scale of the ocean. Humanity was willing to drown in for dominance, technology, and the human soul. Midway symbolized the fusion and the conflict and between human skill and technological evolution. The machines that fought there were the most advanced of their time. Zeros, Wildcats, dauntless dive bombers, torpedoes, radar. Yet behind every innovation was a human heartbeat, fear, determination, and instinct. The battle proved that machines could amplify power, but not replace judgment. It showed that war's essence, the tension between chaos and control, remained rooted in human decision. From the cryptanalysts decoding messages in dark rooms to the pilots diving through smoke at terminal velocity, Midway was a human story. Every number, every explosion, every statistic hides a choice. Someone deciding to act, to risk, to endure. That is what separates history from machinery. Midway reminds us that even in the most technological of wars, victory belongs not to circuits or steel but to courage. The echoes across time. The legacy of Midway extends far beyond the Pacific. Its lessons shaped the Cold War, where carriers became floating deterrents and intelligence became a silent battlefield. It reshaped strategy, doctrine, and diplomacy, proving that information, coordination, and adaptability could overcome numerical superiority. Every modern naval operation, every joint intelligence mission, every satellite-guided strike, all trace their lineage back to June 1942. But beyond the military legacy, Midway left something more profound, a reminder of the fragility of victory itself. That power is never permanent, that pride is always punished, and that in war, the difference between triumph and tragedy is measured in heartbeats. A calm horizon, as the sun sets over Midway Atoll today. The sky glows gold over the endless ocean. The same winds that once carried squadrons of warplanes now drift quietly over the coral reefs. The same sea that swallowed ships now shelters them in peace. In that calm lies the essence of Midway's legacy, not as a celebration of victory, but as a reflection on consequence. Every empire that sails into history leaves wreckage behind. Every triumph hides sorrow. Every loss carries lessons for those who come after. The Pacific remembers. The world remembers. Midway was not the end of a war. It was the beginning of understanding what war truly means. It showed that intelligence can overcome might, that courage can overcome despair, and that even in the darkest hour, the human spirit, fragile yet unyielding, can change the course of history. Epilogue. When historians speak of Midway, they often call it the turning point. But perhaps it was something deeper, a moment when humanity stood at the edge of chaos and, for once, learned from it. Because in the end, Midway was not only about who won, it was about what was lost and what was learned. The ocean keeps its secrets, but beneath the silence, it tells a story bought of courage and arrogance, of luck and judgment, of war and the fragile peace that follows. June 1942, a battle that lasted 3 days and changed the fate of the world forever.